Hello and welcome to Thursdays for the Soul. I am your host today. My name is Jennifer White. Welcome, everyone. Thursdays for the Soul is a series for the whole church. We faithfully focus on care and education for the people of God and create opportunities to digitally worship together as the whole of the United Church of Christ. From prayer, music, and psalms to interviews with key leaders and how-tos in congregational life. This series stays current in the relevant topics of the time and offers opportunities of connection in the wider church and in your community. Together, we can bring our church and the world towards the world God imagines for all of us. We gather every Thursday with new conversations and topics inspired by your questions and comments. As always, we are thankful for your presence, your gifts, and your questions. As you ask questions in this series and in this session, you'll want to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. For those of you that are watching after the fact, feel free to leave a comment or find us on our website to ask us more questions. Friends, let me tell you about what's coming up. Thursday, June 16th, we will have Open and Affirming the Power of Covenant. We'll share best practices we've learned from growing O&A churches, including intersectional advocacy and ways a church can design an O&A conversation that builds consensus and strengthens relationships. This particular session will be part of a special series of Thursdays for the Soul. We will have 12 Just World Covenant programs in the United Church of Christ on the third Thursday of each month. You'll find more information on our website, ucc.org. Thursday, June 23rd, we'll have an update on Manual on Church. You'll join Reverend Dr. Chris Davies and members of the Manual on Church Working Group for a conversation on where we have been, where we are going with the document of best practices and covenantal connections. Attendees of this conversation will get a sneak peek into the newly developed marks of faithful and vital congregations and be invited into the trials of how will this work for your setting? As usual, you can visit ucc.org or any of our social media platforms to find out more about upcoming sessions. Friends, beloveds, if these conversations move you, if what's offered here helps enhance your soul or your ministry, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ. You can do that by visiting our website, or you can do that by texting UCC to 41444. Your prayerful and financial support helps programs just like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Today's session is titled Faithful Election Engagement in a Time of Increased Voter Suppression. Join us as we explore faithful election engagement in a time of increased voter suppression. This session will offer a variety of resources as you support your community and congregations. Friends, beloveds, allow me to introduce to you Mike Nuroff. Hi, Mike. How are you today?
Great, Jennifer. Thank you so much for your introduction and for sharing all the information about the upcoming Thursdays for the Soul webinars. And also, thanks to our colleague, Tracy Howe, for that incredible opening music. I'm Reverend Michael Nuroff, and I serve as your policy advocate for international issues here in our office in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm pleased to moderate this panel with my fellow colleagues here in the DC office to hear more about the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign and ways that it can help equip you with needed tools for nonpartisan and faithful engagement in our democratic process, specifically in the areas of voter registration, issue education, and voter empowerment. As Jennifer said throughout the presentation, if you have questions, please use the Q&A box, and I will direct those questions to our presenters. Without further ado, let's get to know our presenters, who I know quite well, but who I'd love to have introduce themselves. So Sandy, Katie, Jesse, and Thaddeus, in that order, would you please introduce yourselves, your title, and also answer this important question. What is your favorite ice cream flavor and brand? Sandy.
Oh, and brand. Oh my.
And brand.
Uh, Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here for this important conversation. And it's not lost on me that this is a historic day with the January 6th hearings, and so to talk about our democracy and the democratic process seems very fitting. So thanks for being here. I'm Sandy Sorensen, and I am the director of the United Church of Christ Washington office, and I have the honor of working with these wonderful folks every day. And my favorite ice cream, it would be a tie between coffee ice cream and mint chocolate chip. And I in terms of brand, I have to say Ben and Jerry's, they're doing the right stuff.
Yes. Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Adams, and I am your policy advocate for domestic issues in the Washington, D.C. office. And I really love a local ice cream place called Julie Ice Cream. They make an amazing mint chocolate chip.
All right. I'll have to check that out. Jesse.
Thank you, Mike. Hi, I am Jessie Quinn. I'm the online communications specialist for the Washington, D.C. office. Derry and I don't agree. However, my favorite ice cream is the So Delicious mint chocolate chip made with coconut milk. So mint chocolate chip seems to be a popular flavor here in the DC area.
It does.
Mike.
It's good to note for future staff meetings, Sandy. Thaddeus. How about you?
All right, my name is Thaddeus Elliott. I am the Justice and Peace Fellow here in the Washington, D.C. office. And my favorite ice cream flavor is a chocolate chip cookie dough. But then a favorite brand, I'm a Florida boy, so I will say Bluebell because it tastes like the good old days. And still a half gallon, unlike others.
I forgot, I neglected to answer the question myself. So I'll say for me, it's also mint chocolate chip, but it's Grater's Ice Cream, which is a ice cream brand from Cincinnati, Ohio. All right, maybe let's move on. So Sandy Sorensen, the director of our office, has been working in this office for over 30 years. And a significant part of her work has been really staffing and promoting the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign, which is a major project that we work on here in DC. Sandy, can you talk a bit about the history of the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign and why the UCC engages in this electoral work?
Sure. Thank you, Mike. Yes, the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign inaugural campaign was in 2004. And it grew out of the 2000 elections. And if you remember, one of the things that the 2000 elections revealed to us, there were, in some places there were exceedingly long lines and people didn't get a chance to vote. There was the great hanging Chad controversy around the ballots. What became apparent, or what we were reminded of, because we already knew this, is that our election laws, because they are state and local, leave us with a patchwork of election laws that are different all around the country. And so there's no way to really ensure, for example, to make sure that there are policies to protect people from discrimination. That's why we had to pass the Voting Rights Act. And unfortunately, the meat of that was gutted by the Supreme Court. And so knowing that, state and local election law kind of rule the day, we realized that one of the ways that we could really help people and help the democratic process flourish would be by making sure that everybody was engaged and everybody cleared the way, that we all worked hard to make sure that everybody's voice was heard and everybody's vote would be counted. And so that was how we conceived of the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign as a way for UCC members and congregations to lift their voices and to make sure that every vote was counted and every voice was heard. So we began back in 2004. We have had an Our Faith, Our Vote campaign every other year, every presidential and election year since then. And so, of course, we are in the midst of our vote campaign this year, and we'll talk more about that later. But we wanted to provide nonpartisan, faith-based tools for UCC members and congregations to engage in the electoral process.
Thanks for that, Sandy. I have two follow-up questions to that. Why do you see, or why do you believe it's important for us to do this work as people of faith? And then I'll follow up again with a question about kind of partisanship. But can you answer kind of why do you feel like this is critical for us as people of faith to be doing this work?
So I often tell people that what we construe as politics is really how we order our common life. And if you look at the scripture, all throughout the scripture, from the Hebrew scripture to the Christian scripture, it talks about the ways in which we are to have right relationship with each other. And much of that means caring for the most vulnerable among us, being just and fair with each other in our dealings. And so that idea of how we order our common life is very much rooted in our faith. And we're all really political beings, whether we're conscious of it or act upon that. We all engage in a world in which there are policies made and decisions made that impact our lives. And so because of that, since we are political beings, it's important to tap into the power of our faith to help us act in a way that is empowers those values to be seen. And so when we look at scripture, our faith tradition, the teachings of Jesus, we get a core vision of God's intention for all people and for creation. And that is the vision that becomes our sort of, if you will, party platform. I'm inching a little bit into your second question, Mike, but there's a difference between, and an important difference between being political, which is engaging in the democratic process and making our voice heard and expressing our values, and being partisan, which is being an adherent to a very particular ideology or set of beliefs or approaches to political life. For us as people of faith, the scripture provides our vision. The ministry of Jesus provides our vision of what a fair and just world should look like. And I would just hasten to add that Jesus's ministry was not a meek and mild ministry. Jesus overturned the tables. Jesus regularly challenged the social practices of his day. And ultimately, Jesus was executed by the state for his ministry. So it's important to know that this work is we often need to challenge the systems and structures that we find ourselves in. I know many of our congregations are doing, and many of you out there are doing amazing direct ministry work, especially in this time of COVID. I have heard so many amazing stories of individuals and congregations that have risen to the challenge of so many people being pushed to the margins, so many more people being pushed into the river of poverty and lack of housing and lack of healthcare and lack of education and food insecurity. So many people being pushed to those margins. And when people are in that river, they need to be pulled out. And so our direct service ministries that so many of you engage in are so incredibly important and inspiring. And they really are complementary to the work that we do around public policy advocacy, which is to walk upstream and ask questions that come out of our direct service ministries. Why is the unhoused population in our community growing? What's happening around zoning laws and affordable housing that's causing this? And what can we do to ensure that fewer and fewer people have to fall into that river of being unhoused? And so the two really go together. And our direct service ministries give us the stories that we are then able to take to decision makers who set the policies and priorities of our country. And we're able to shape some of that policy making and priority setting by going to them and telling their stories. And of course, it matters who is making those decisions. It matters who the people are empowered to make those decisions. And that's why our vote matters. It matters, our elected officials ultimately shape these policies, and we are the ones who put them into office.
Thank you for that, Sandy. That was a lot. You made a really strong case about why we are called to engage in policy work and even in politics. Can you say just a bit more about concerns that people have that work can edge toward partisanship and why we're not able to engage in partisan work?
Yes. So, for example, in the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign, we encourage people when they're doing voter registration or issue education or voter mobilization, which are all the components of Our Faith, Our Vote, that they do that and are open to people of any political party or no political party. So when we do voter registration, it's open to anybody. When we do issue education, the focus is on the issues, not on any particular candidate and not on any particular political party, but on the issues that are of concern to us and how might those issues be addressed in our public policy. So we advise people to not to endorse particular candidates or political parties. And when they do candidate forums, we encourage people to make sure that everybody who's running for that particular office is invited so that no one is left out. And so in that way, we are able to speak to issues that we are able to speak to the issues that we care about without necessarily speaking to particular political candidates or contributing to their campaigns. And in many ways, this makes us much more prophetic than a lot of the other groups that do make political campaign contributions and sort of have a candidate that they're particularly attached to. We're able to speak truth to power, and we're able to do that because we don't endorse any particular political candidates or particular political parties.
Thanks for that distinction, Sandy. I know there's some resources up on our Faith Our Vote website that also delve in deeper into what you can and can't do. But maybe, as Sandy said, this is a major project of our office, and really it's an all hands on deck campaign for us. And so maybe I'll pivot to some of our comments from some of my other colleagues here. Thaddeus, to turn to you. The 2022 midterm elections are coming in just a few months. Can you explain to folks what we mean when we say midterm elections? Who's being elected, and can you explain why the midterms are important?
Yes, I can. So when we are talking about midterm elections, they are simply the elections that happen halfway in the middle of a presidential term. This is because for members of the House, they are up for election every 2 years. They only have 2-year terms. So pretty much every main election cycle, they're going to be up, as well as a third of Senate seats. Senators serving 6-year terms, they overlap in that sense. So at the federal level, we're focused primarily on congressional races and the makeup of the House of Representatives and the Senate. As well, at the state and local levels, you'll have governor races, mayoral races, other state and local official races, plus state constitutional amendments and propositions and other localized ballot initiatives. So their impact and their importance transcends at all levels of government. Yeah. And so generally, these races tend to have lower turnout than presidential elections, just because there's not one big national race that that catches everyone's attention. So the intensity can vary based on state and local and who's kind of up for office. But as I said before, the results do determine the makeup of Congress, who in turn pass or not federal legislation. And historically, when it comes to like the executive branch and that interplay, the party of the sitting president oftentimes loses some seats and stuff. So that can present either a hindrance, or in some rare cases, it could be an aid to an administration's ability to accomplish their policy agenda.
Right. Thanks for that, Thaddeus. So we've heard now a bit about why we're called to this work and the upcoming opportunity of the midterms to be engaged. I wonder if, Katie, if you could speak to really as we look ahead for the upcoming midterms, what are the key dates that you see for engagement? What might be a rough timeline that you would have folks consider of engaging?
Sure. Well, like Thaddeus just said, we are hitting the midterms, and I think it's really important for some voters to remember that they themselves might be in a different congressional district than they last voted in 2020, because the US Census resulted in redistricting. So be sure to check your voter registration status and make sure you know which district you're voting in, because that has changed in many states. And so if we look at the primaries, a lot of primaries have already happened, but there's a lot more ahead of us with the next large tranche just coming up this week. And those go all the way through to September. So be sure to look up what your primaries are. And every state is a little different. So in some states, everyone participates in the primary regardless of what party you're registered. Some, that's not the case, and you have to, the party that you're registered with is the primary that you vote in. So again, be sure to check your local and state election laws and see if you have a primary coming up, or if your primary is ahead of you. It could be in September, which is when some of the last ones are. And then also remember, September 20th is National Voter Registration Day. We'll be doing a lot of work around that as well, but that's a great day to maybe put on your calendars if your congregation wants to do some voter registration work. And then obviously November 8th is the general election. And so that's the big one. And that's kind of when the midterm election season ends. So
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for that timeline. I know you mentioned voter registration. I think that that brings up the question of, over the past years, we've seen an acceleration of efforts, particularly in states, to institute laws that really restrict voting access and suppress the vote, particularly for the vulnerable and marginalized communities. I know you work a lot on these issues. Can you speak to how this is being addressed now in Congress?
Thanks for that question, Mike. So many advocates worked tirelessly in this last Congress to try and get something through that would really help improve access to voting. And passage of the Freedom to Vote Act, which started out as the For the People Act, ultimately didn't pass because there was obstruction in Congress. Despite this setback, though, the ground has really been seeded for future campaigns to pass comprehensive voting reform. And we've shown what's possible. Advocates worked really, really hard on this and were tireless in moving something forward. Mike, I think what you're going to ask me next might be what's happening in the states.
Yeah, so much of this is happening at the state level. Can you speak to that, Katie?
And, that's less great news because in the states, efforts to restrict voting have really continued since the 2020 election. And clearly there were efforts before then, but as a result of the 2020 election and the massive voter turnout, we've seen a lot of states make a lot of efforts to restrict voting. At least 27 states have introduced over 250 bills with restrictive voting provisions. These restrictive bills being considered primarily will curtail access to mail-in voting, imposing new or stricter voter ID requirements for in-person voting and registration. Other trends include new barriers to voters with disabilities, limiting or eliminating same-day voter registration, and new and onerous proof of citizenship requirements. In addition to the legislation making it more difficult to vote and for voters to cast ballots, we're also seeing an uptick in the number of bills that will enable partisan interference in election administration. The most extreme of these examples would allow partisan officials to simply reject election results. Most of them target fair election administration in other ways. And so I think that that's also something to keep an eye out. We're hopeful that, like I said, in future Congresses, we'll have the opportunity to pass something very similar to the Freedom to Vote Act or the For the People Act and restore voting rights. But there's a lot of work to be done. A little later on, I'm also going to talk about some of the important things for your congregations to keep in mind if they do engage in voter registration work. So stay tuned for that.
Right, thank you for that, Katie. So we know that elections matter. Each election and change in political leadership presents new challenges and changes. And this is kind of for maybe all three of you, for Sandy, Thaddeus, and Katie. Can you speak to what you see as the critical issues that are on the line within this upcoming election? And why is it so important that we vote for leadership that really reflects our values on these issues? Maybe I'll start with you, Sandy. What do you feel like is most on the line come November?
So, Mike, there are a lot of urgent issues on the line in November. One that I would highlight particularly is reproductive justice and the access to the full range of healthcare for all women, regardless of their background. Many of us know that the Supreme Court is poised to rule on a case that challenges the Roe v. Wade decision. And it has already resulted in a wave of states banning abortion care. But not only that, also in many cases, shutting down women's health clinics that provided a range of healthcare, cancer screenings, prenatal care, nutrition counseling, domestic violence abuse counseling. And so in many states, there may only be one clinic in the entire state left that can provide those services. And so we're at a real crisis point in terms of women's health care. And pending the decision, it could become even more dire. And so over the past year, we've worked on legislative fixes for that, like the Women's Health Protection Act, which would ensure that women could access these services free of discrimination. That did not pass, and that is another reason why it matters who we put in office, because they're the ones who may pass or not pass these pieces of legislation.
Great. Thaddeus, which issues do you feel like are most on the line for you?
I would say issues pertaining to the climate crisis that we're experiencing. We're running out of time to mitigate any further damage. The latest International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report from April states that our global carbon emissions must peak by 2025. So that's 3 years. And then we'll have to dramatically reduce by 45 to 50% those emission levels by 2030 in order to avert major ecological devastation. So what that would require of us domestically to meet that goal is a complete transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy and movement toward greener and cleaner energy and manufacturing solutions. These include increasing the availability and usage of zero-emission electric vehicles, not just personal cars and automobiles, but electric heavy-duty trucks and transit vehicles as well, investing in renewable energy like wind and solar, and creating more climate-resilient housing and communities and other infrastructure. However, along with this transition, there will be a required increase in demand for things like critical minerals like lithium, nickel, and cobalt that are key components in these technologies. And so that will result in an increase in extraction activities like mining that have local environmental impacts. So to mitigate those impacts, we also need to have legislation that centers environmental justice, that is critical and paying attention to the needs of directly impacted communities that are often low income, rural, and Black, Indigenous communities of color. And this is critical just to maintain the health and safety of those communities as we transition away to a more greener and cleaner economy.
So, Katie, your thoughts?
I'm going to talk about something very exciting, which is budgets. And I know they are. And, who we elect in Congress, determines what our federal budget looks like. And every year is a real struggle for money to help people who need it the most and help the most vulnerable. And every year we devote more and more of our budget to the military industrial complex. And I know that's a little bit your issue too, Mike. But, so on the line are, the real decisions about where we put our money as a country and the decisions that we make about how we help, homelessness and child tax credit. And, last year we just about halved poverty in this country. And it was amazing because people who hadn't been able to get food for their children and were able to. And then the child tax credit expired and all of those families are back in the same place they were, which proves to us that poverty is a policy choice that's being made over and over again by our elected officials. And so budgets are what's on the line. And I know they don't sound that super interesting, but they are vital to making sure that we're able to, like I said, help the most vulnerable. So thank you.
Mike, I would just add, I think another issue that I imagine is very front and center for so many of us is issues around gun violence prevention. And we just saw the House pass the Protect Our Kids Act, which is a wonderful piece of legislation that would address many of our concerns around gun violence prevention. Unfortunately, its fate in the Senate is not hopeful. Again, this is why it matters who we elect. It matters for the policies that we want to see put into practice. But there are a number of legislative measures that are common sense, reasonable measures to reduce gun violence. I just attended a rally yesterday, and several gun owners spoke and said they were very much pro strengthening background checks, having safety safe storage requirements, extreme protection risk laws, and other measures that are reasonable, measured ways that we could reduce gun violence. So I would imagine that for so many of us after the horrific recent shootings and then the daily toll of gun violence every day, that this would be an important issue.
Thanks for that. And I'll just take a point of privilege to say, I think on the international side, certainly this election will be taking place, hopefully not, but probably still in a time of war in Ukraine. and continued escalation of tensions with Russia. Certainly, I think there'll be this election will be seen to some degree as in response to the administration's handling of that conflict, as well as how it's handled other foreign policy matters in Latin America, tensions with Iran and North Korea, and other issues, and kind of a broad continued escalation of militarization of our foreign policy, I think is likely a factor. But let's take a step away from the policy talk and let's think about how we work on this issue, what resources the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign offers for us. And so I wonder if Jesse, as our communication specialist, can you share some of the resources that are available to congregations to help us get engaged in these midterms?
Yes, thank you, Mike. I would love to talk about the resources. So as Sandy mentioned earlier, the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign is made up of 3 main components. So that's issue education, voter registration, and voter mobilization and empowerment. So because we know, kind of as we talked about, there might be more barriers to face this year in getting to the polls, the tools we have as part of the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign are going to be more important as ever. I'm going to mention that all the tools I'm going to mention and all the resources I'm going to talk about can be found on our website at ourfaithourvote.org, which will be in the chat and also in follow-up information. So first, I want to start by talking about issue education. So it's so important that we as voters understand what's at stake in the elections, what issues we're really passionate about, and where the candidates we may be voting for stand on those issues. So like the issues we just talked about, like maybe you want to know how your elected official might vote on gun legislation, or how your elected official stands on voting rights legislation. Some of this you need to do research for, but we have tried to create the tools to make this easy, starting with our issue education page on our Faith, Our Vote website. There you can find one-page helpers with information on the major issues where we in the UCC have historically stood on those issues. We include some action steps for you to participate on that issue, as well as tailored questions that you can pose to your candidates related to where they stand on those issues. We also have an awesome tool called the Find Your Legislator tool. And when you enter some basic information, you can find out with just one click who your representatives are from the federal, state, all the way down to the local level. And on there, you can learn more about those elected leaders. You can see their websites, their social media. You can even contact them from our site. So I'd encourage everyone to check that out and learn more about the people that are already elected to represent you. I would also ask everyone who hasn't already to sign up for our Justice and Peace Action Network. Every week, our team in DC, who you've heard from here, tracks legislation moving in Congress, and we use all that information we have to send targeted action alerts every Thursday with scripted emails and tweets for you to send directly to your legislators to let them know how you feel on an issue. So that's a great way to learn about the issues as well as establish a rapport with your elected leaders. So those are some of the tools related to the issue education component of the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign. The next component is voter registration. So UCC congregations for years and years have been crucial in getting people registered to vote by hosting voter registration drives, by registering as polling stations, by having voter registration forms and keeping those in your church. So I probably don't need to tell many of you how important it is to get people registered. But what I can say is that we have some really great tools to help you do that and add on to maybe what you already are doing as well. So the first one is our Civic Action Center. So from our Civic Action Center, which is also linked on our website, you can check your voter registration and you can actually get registered from there. So as Katie was mentioning earlier, it might be really smart to recheck your voter registration coming up this year. And there's the place to do it right on our website. You can also from there find upcoming dates, times, and polling locations for the elections in your area. It makes it so simple. for people to just you could just have the Civic Action Center up maybe on a computer in your church if you have it, or an easy link to share in a church newsletter, a good way to get people to check their voter registration. Another thing I want to mention related to this is our legal tips for congregational engagement. So we touched on this earlier, but I want to make sure people know what resources are available. We have both a really good instructional video and a helpful document clearly highlighting the do's and don'ts of election engagement. These resources have been created with the brilliant guidance of Heather Kimmel, who's the United Church of Christ General Counsel. They're to encourage congregations to get involved without concern for jeopardizing the tax exempt status of our congregations. So I think that was also a question that came up. So I want to make sure that people know we do have resources addressing what you can and can't do. So those guidelines are very clear. Also on our website, we have pages with resources specifically tailored for college students and other young adults. I want to mention this and highlight this. I think it's really important because historically, voter turnout in the 18 to 29 age range has been really low when compared to overall voter turnout. And a part of this, not the whole thing, but a large part of this is voter registration. So we want to think voter registration is easy, but it can be really difficult and maybe intimidating for first-time voters. And our role as UCC members and people of faith is really important in this because we have an opportunity to engage with young people maybe in our congregations and also maybe possibly through campus ministries if you have any connections with campus ministries. So that's a great way to work on voter registration, and we have guidelines for that as well. So all of this information I have talked about really leads to the last component of the Our Faith, Our Vote campaign, which is a voter mobilization and empowerment. We have learned about the issues at stake now, and we know where the candidates stand. We've gotten ourselves and our community registered. Okay, now it's time to get out the vote. So in recent decades, only about 40% of eligible voting population votes during the midterm elections. 40%. I think that's low. That's according to Census Bureau data. So unfortunately, with the rise of suppressive voting legislation, we may see a lower turnout in upcoming elections, but there are things that we can be doing in our congregations and our communities to get out the vote. So on our website, you can find an entire page dedicated to what we can be doing to get out the vote. Some examples are organizing a phone bank at your congregation, reminding people of upcoming election dates, organizing rides to the polls, especially for maybe older adults in your congregation who may not have easy access to transportation, and participating in the UCC Votes project, which involves you sharing why it's important to you as a person of faith to vote and to encourage other UCC folks to do the same. And the instructions for this project and all these other resources are, again, on our website, ourfaithourvote.org. So another really important tool that I want to mention before I wrap up is the Election Protection Hotline. For those of you who don't know, Election Protection is a national nonpartisan coalition that works year-round to ensure all voters have the opportunity to vote and that their votes get counted. The hotline offers immediate guidance and assistance for all stages of voting. So what we can all do is make sure to save their number in our phones, and they have a number for English speaking, for Spanish speaking, for Arabic speaking, and multiple numbers for Asian speaking help if you need those different supports. And a link to that, also their website and information is on our website. So share these numbers with everyone you know, so that if anyone encounters any sort of issue with registration, with absentee or early voting, or with casting their vote at the polls, we can find access to the support we need to get those votes counted. For those big on social media like myself, they also have Facebook and Twitter support. So you can also follow them on Facebook and Twitter, and they'll tweet updates on if there's any issues in polling areas, or you can actually DM their social media. Lastly, I would challenge everyone, including my colleagues on this call with me, to participate in our vote tripling campaign. So this sign on, which is found on our website, will mean that you pledge to help ensure 3, be it family members, friends, fellow congregants, etc., to get registered, have a plan to vote, and you follow through with them on that plan. So this is a great way to get out the vote while also building community and sharing with others the importance of civic engagement. We did this in 2020, and it was really great to see how much, just like each person getting 3 more people to vote, it really spreads the network and makes this a community experience. So you could share that in your congregation. Okay, I could really go on about all of the great resources that we offer through Our Faith, Our Vote. But I'll stop now and just encourage all of us to think about how we can be engaged leading up to the midterms, and how we can be using some of these tools in our congregations and our communities. There's one really important thing that I want to mention as we all engage in upcoming elections, and that's that the landscape of this year in election are different, and there have been a lot of changes to voting laws across the country, as we've kind of touched on. So I would like to just ask Katie, who can explain it a lot better than I, to offer some insight and recommendation for those of us planning to engage in voter registration and other get out the vote efforts. So Katie, can I pass it to you?
Jesse, and thank you so much for that really in-depth look at Our Faith, Our Vote. I think one of the things that I love so much is there are so many resources available if you go peruse the website. So encourage people to check over with that. I do want to make sure that we're talking about some of the challenges that are being faced in voter registration, and just making sure that as you, your congregation and community decide to engage in voter registration work and get out the vote work, you make sure that you carefully check what the rules are in your state. So I wanted to give just a brief example for what some of the new changes are in Texas. In Texas, they've increase their voter ID laws to make them more stringent. So if you don't have a form of ID, you have to fill out a reasonable impediment declaration and prove other forms of documentation. You also can't register to vote online anymore. You have to download the form or go in person to get a paper registration, and you mail in your copy. If you do go to an in-person voter registration, or you host an in-person voter registration, the only people at those events who can accept a registration are volunteer deputy voter registers, which means if you want to help people register to vote in Texas, the only way to do so is to become a volunteer deputy voter registrar, which requires a training and unique ID numbers. Your voter ID then has to be signed by those volunteer deputy registrars, registered and returned to the state within 5 days, or they're invalid. And all of this has to be done at least 30 days before the election. There is no same-day registration. So those are just some of the very complicated rules in Texas, and there are several other states that have similar challenges like that now. And they make it much harder to register. They make it much harder to help people vote, which is appalling, because the easiest thing it should be to vote. But I really want to make sure that we want to make sure that as folks engage, you're checking up on those laws so you don't run afoul of them, because there are more penalties in place. And so we want to make sure that everyone is protected, and everyone is able to engage safely and without running afoul of anything. Someone did ask a question about where to go to check on their voter registration. And you can, depending on, again, where you live, but you can check with your local Board of Elections. And you can find that out from, going to your Secretary of State. Check on your own voter registration status. Like Jesse said, you can use the tool that we have, and that's on the Our Faith, Our Vote page as well. But if you have specific questions, you can go to your Secretary of State, you can go to your elected your election officials, your local election officials. It's a lot of words at once. We really encourage that anyway as a great way to, make sure that you have an open dialogue and communication with them. So thank you, Jesse.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you, Christine James, for that question about redistricting and where to go for finding out where the information and where you can vote. I had a final question, and maybe I'll pose this to Sandy. Sandy, we had a question that related to it that came in as well from a participant. And as a reminder, for those of you who are wanting to offer questions, please do so in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So Sandy, the question came in from Dorothy. How do we overturn tables as Jesus did without losing tax-exempt status as a nonprofit? So that begged the question that we wanted to ask you as well, which was kind of what are creative ways that churches have participated in Our Faith or Vote? So can you combine those two questions together? What are creative ways for churches to engage that overturn tables without losing their tax-exempt status?
It's a great question. So I think, first and foremost, as we were mentioning before, just making very sure that you are not, as a congregation, endorsing a particular candidate or a particular party, and that when you do encourage candidate forums or other campaign events where candidates appear, make sure that if you are offering up your space, that it's open to every candidate who's running for that particular office. I think we best do this by focusing in on the issues that we care about. That's really the best way to remain nonpartisan. And so when we do things like issue education, one of the things I encourage congregations to do is look within your congregation. I'm sure that there are healthcare workers there, teachers, law enforcement people. If you want to have a forum about issues that you care about in the elections, talk with each other. One of the things that is most impactful that we can do is share our stories. And it's particularly powerful when we're in a community where we share our stories, and where I hear the story of my neighbor who is an emergency room doctor and might tell me about what it's like to treat a gunshot wound. And in that way, we stick to the issues that we care about, and not so much to the particular political parties or partisan politics. So I think that piece is really important, maintaining a focus really on the issue. This is what we want to see happen, and making sure that that's the primary thing that we convey.
Great. Another question or two that have come in. One is from Susan. What about encouraging people to become poll monitors and election workers? And I'll expand that to an extent of speak to that form of engagement, as well as maybe what advice you would give to those who are not yet 18 who would like to be involved. What about younger people as well? What can they do?
I'll take the younger voter question, and maybe Thaddeus, you might want to jump in as well. But in many states that don't have more restrictive laws, it's still possible for young people to register folks to vote. We've had youth groups do voter registration campaigns, and they had shirts on that said, "I can't vote, but you can." So they were holding their adults accountable. I also would encourage you to think about ways that you can surface up the concerns and the hopes and the dreams that your children and youth have. What are they hoping for? What are they fearful about? What do they wish would change in the world? And really, those can be some of the things that help to guide the congregation itself as it's thinking about, as we're thinking about the decisions we want to make in this election, kind of having the voices of our young people in our heads.
What about the question of becoming poll monitors and election workers?
Absolutely. Katie touched on this, it's such an important thing to reach out to our local election officials, regardless of, whether we're getting updates about election law, particularly after the 2020 elections. As many of you may have seen, many state and local election officials were harassed, were having to just go through kind of a lot of harassment and abuse, really. And it's so important that we honor the people who are making our electoral process possible, and also that we participate in it. That's how we learn about it. So making those connections and relationships are so important, especially in this time when we're so polarized, we're so divided. Finding, a way to create relationships of respect and value for the people that are administering our elections.
We had another question that came in. Maybe I'll do two more. Another one came in from Christine. She asked, I wonder how the UCC would guide congregations in states that do not have contested congressional elections in the fall, or where legislatures are working to protect or even expand access to the polls to provide support to fellow congregations in states that will have important congressional elections in the fall. Maybe I'll cut it off there. Can you speak to that question? Any of the three of you?
Sure. Well, every state will have a congressional election this fall. They're all members of the House are up for re-election. And if you live in a state that has, that are working to expand access to vote, that's great. And that's kind of, if you want to engage in, helping educate, or, if you want to contact your member of Congress, ask them to pass the For the People Act. I know that it didn't pass the Senate, but it's still really important to continue that drumbeat of making sure that we pass these important pieces of legislation. And so, if you want to engage further, we'd love to have, more engagement with Our Faith, Our Vote. So I hope you'll be able to find a few ways that you can get involved that way.
I would just add to Katie's points that don't overlook like local elections. You may think that your congressional election is it's not that big a deal, but school boards and city councils, all of those elections are critical, and that makes a difference on how housing and zoning laws are established in your community, and that makes a difference on whether or not there's affordable housing. So don't overlook the local elections, and also contact your family and friends in other states. Ask them, say, your vote is really important. I hope you have a plan to vote, and continue to remind them of the importance of their vote.
Maybe I'll offer one more question since we're at time. We know that elections can get ugly. We know that conversations about politics and elections get ugly at our own dinner tables, not only in wider society. And so wondering if you could speak a bit to any of you, how can we elevate the discourse about elections and engaging in this work? And also maybe what sustains you in this work, or what are your hopes for this upcoming electoral season, in terms of your engagement? Maybe I'll turn to the three of you, or the four of you, to see if you have any thoughts along those lines. Maybe I'll start with Thaddeus. Do you have any response to
that? Yes, I do. So thinking in the way that we engage others around sensitive issues, we know politics can sometimes feel like a dirty thing to talk about, because it can stir up strong emotions in one another. But it's important to keep in mind that, again, what is political to us matters. It's about it's our values. It's about our common life together. And so for me, I find it's always helpful that whoever I'm engaging with, I have to remember that they're a human being just like me, and they have thoughts and concerns. And all of us have very complex political views and values that are informed by a lot of different beliefs and experiences. But that if we keep that common understanding, we're able to bridge across a difference and really engage in ways, especially if we take out kind of the tribalism of partisanship and feeling like we need to fall into one camp or another. I find focusing specifically on the issues and what really is central and core to what we care about is often a way that you can have more productive conversations and engagement with each other.
I would just add to that's wonderful, Thaddeus. Thank you. And just to add to that, two things. One is staying rooted in story, I think is a really good way to, we can debate statistics and we can debate particular, aspects of policy, but when we share stories of what we're actually seeing and experiencing in our own families, in our own communities, that's really powerful, and it's a powerful way to engage people. And the other piece I would add is come to these conversations with a curious mind. I've often found it interesting to engage somebody who's in a very different place than I am on a particular issue, and just ask the question, wow, that's just really a different way of seeing it. It's so interesting. I don't see it. I haven't see it that quite that way. Can you tell me how you came to believe that? Can you tell me how you came to that position, so that you invite curiosity and questions?
It's a very diplomatic way of engaging. What about Jesse or Katie? Do you have final thoughts along those lines?
I think my colleagues answered it very well.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. Jennifer, I think we'll turn it back over to you. Oh, actually, Sandy's going to close us with a word of prayer. Sandy, would you be willing to close us out?
I would like to. Thank you. So I'm actually going to share just a brief reading from an environmental activist and advocate writer, Rebecca Solnit. And I'm thinking about the fact that the January 6th hearings begin today, and it's a pivotal time for our democratic process. And as John Lewis notes, voting is the most powerful tool we have for nonviolent social change. So our vote really, really matters, even though we're in tremendously challenging times and we have incredibly difficult issues before us. Our vote is our prime tool of nonviolent change, and it's one thing that we can do in this time when it feels like there's so much that we can't do. And so I want to share this quote from Rebecca Solnit that I know has helped me quite a bit in these uncertain times. And this is from her book of essays, Hope in the Dark. Hope locates itself in the premise that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. When you recognize uncertainty, you may recognize that you may be able to influence the outcome. You alone, or in concert with a few dozen or several million others. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and how it may impact are not things that we can know beforehand. Thank you all so very much for engaging in this critical conversation. I look forward to hearing your stories. I hope you'll share with us the things that you're doing, and know that these amazing colleagues are available to answer any further questions and have a wealth of information. We tried to keep this to an hour, but as you can tell, we have lots to share. So
All right.
but thank you for your commitment to be here.
Yep. Thank you, Sandy, and thank you all for coming. Blessings.
Siblings in Christ, if this conversation has moved you, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or your soul, please consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help programs like this in the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed as you continue your day. Know that you are not alone, and we are holding you in prayer. Amen.